Lieutenant Richard Bong's P-38. Lightning shuddered violently as 20-millimeter cannon rounds tore through the left engine cowling. At 18,000 feet above the Solomon Islands, he was alone, his wingman already spiraling into the Pacific Ocean below, trailing black smoke. The August 1943 sun blazed through his canopy as he threw the twin-boomed fighter into another desperate banking turn. But the Japanese Zero behind him matched the maneuver effortlessly, closing the distance with predatory precision. Bong had been trained at the best fighter schools in America. He knew every defensive tactic in the manual: barrel rolls, split S's, chandelle, scissors maneuvers. He had tried them all in the last 90 seconds, and the Zero pilot had countered each one with casual efficiency. Now the enemy fighter was less than 200 yards behind him, positioned perfectly in his vulnerable 6 o'clock. Guns lined up for the killing shot that would send Bong to join his wingman in the ocean. His instrument panel was a chaos of warning lights. Oil pressure dropping on the damaged engine. Airspeed bleeding off as he fought to keep the nose up. Altitude winding down as gravity and battle damage conspired against him. In perhaps 10 more seconds, the Zero's guns would finish what they'd started, and Richard Bong would become another statistic in the brutal arithmetic of Pacific air combat. Then, with death staring him in the face and no options remaining in the fighter pilot's playbook, Bong did something that every instructor had warned him would kill him instantly. He rolled the P-38 completely inverted, wheels pointing at the sky, and shoved the control stick violently forward. The Lightning's nose dropped toward the ocean in a screaming vertical dive. But Bong wasn't diving normally. He was plunging toward the Pacific upside down, with blood rushing into his skull so fast that his vision turned crimson and the instrument panel disappeared into a red blur. For 2 seconds that felt like an eternity. Richard Bong flew blind through negative G forces that no training manual said his aircraft could survive. The P-38's twin Allison engines screamed in protest. Loose equipment and spent shell casings floated up from the cockpit floor and slammed into the canopy above his head. His oxygen mask felt like it was trying to tear itself off his face. Every blood vessel in his eyes felt ready to burst. When he finally rolled the aircraft right side up at 12,000 feet, having dropped 6,000 feet in those 2 terrifying seconds, the Zero was gone. Not just behind him, gone completely, vanished from the sky as if it had never existed. Bong circled cautiously, scanning every quadrant of the sky, but found nothing. The Japanese fighter that had been seconds away from killing him had simply disappeared. What Richard Bong didn't know in that moment, gasping for breath and wiping blood from his eyes, was that he had just accidentally discovered a maneuver that would change the entire Pacific Air War. A desperate, impossible, suicidal-looking trick that would break the Japanese Zero's reign of terror over Allied pilots and ultimately help turn the tide of the war in the Pacific. Within months, what began as one terrified pilot's instinctive panic move would become whispered fighter pilot wisdom that spread across every airfield from Guadalcanal to the Philippines. This is the story of how American pilots learned to fly upside down to survive, and how that discovery transformed the deadliest aircraft in the Pacific theater, from an unstoppable killing machine into a target that American fighters could finally beat. It's the story of innovation born from desperation, and of how the laws of physics ultimately proved more powerful than the most maneuverable fighter plane ever built. To understand why Bong's accidental discovery was so revolutionary, you need to understand just how completely the Japanese Zero dominated the Pacific skies in 1942 and early 1943. When American pilots first encountered the Mitsubishi A6M Zero in combat, they couldn't believe what they were seeing. This Japanese fighter violated every assumption American military intelligence had made about enemy capabilities. The Zero could turn inside any Allied fighter with contemptuous ease. It could climb faster, fly farther, and operate at higher altitudes than anything the Americans had. In the early battles over the Philippines, Wake Island, and the Dutch East Indies, Japanese pilots flying Zeros were achieving kill ratios that seemed impossible. For every 3 Japanese aircraft shot down, the Allies were losing 9. In some engagements, the ratio was even worse. The aircraft itself was a masterpiece of lightweight engineering. Designer Jiro Horikoshi had created a fighter that weighed just 3,700 pounds empty, compared to over 5,000 pounds for American fighters, like the P-40 Warhawk. This weight savings came from radical design choices. The Zero had no armor plating to protect the pilot. The fuel tanks were unprotected, lacking the self-sealing technology that American aircraft employed. The airframe itself was built to minimum stress tolerances, sacrificing durability for maneuverability. But in dogfighting performance, these sacrifices created a fighter that seemed supernatural. The Zero could complete a 360-degree turn in just under 16 seconds at combat speeds. An American P-40 required 23 seconds for the same maneuver. When 2 fighters merged in combat, 7 seconds might as well be an eternity. It meant that every time an American pilot tried to turn with a Zero, the Japanese fighter would complete its circle and end up on the American's tail with guns lined up for an easy kill. American pilots were dying by the dozens because they were trying to fight the Zero on its own terms. Fighter tactics in 1942 were still heavily influenced by World War I dogfighting doctrine. Pilots were taught to turn, to get inside the enemy's circle, to maneuver until they could bring their guns to bear. This worked beautifully against German fighters in Europe, which were heavier and less maneuverable than their Allied counterparts. But in the Pacific, this doctrine was a death sentence. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, one of the Navy's most innovative tacticians, watched his pilots die in training exercises against captured Zeros and became obsessed with finding a solution. He spent weeks analyzing the Zero's capabilities and realized something crucial. Yes, the Zero could turn better than anything America had. Yes, it could climb faster, but the Zero's lightweight construction created vulnerabilities that could be exploited if American pilots stopped trying to turn with it. American fighters had advantages the Zero couldn't match. The P-38 Lightning, P-47 Thunderbolt, and F-4U Corsair all had more powerful engines that gave them superior speed in level flight and especially in dives. They had rugged construction that could survive battle damage that would tear a Zero apart. Their fuel systems were designed to tolerate violent maneuvering without starving the engines of fuel. And crucially, their pilots were protected by armor plating and reinforced cockpits. Thatch developed what became known as the weave, a defensive maneuver where 2 American fighters would fly in coordination, protecting each other from Japanese attacks. It worked, and it saved lives, but it required perfect coordination between wingmen and was fundamentally defensive. It could help American pilots survive, but it didn't give them a way to actually beat the Zero in combat. For that, they needed something else, something that would come from desperation rather than tactical planning. The combat encounter that changed everything happened on April 7, 1943, over the Russell Islands in the Solomon Chain. Major Thomas Lynch, of the 39th Fighter Squadron flying a P-38 Lightning, found himself in exactly the situation that had killed so many of his fellow pilots. 8 Japanese Zeros had bounced his flight from above, and in the chaos of the initial merge, Lynch became separated from his wingmen. Now he was alone at 20,000 feet, with multiple enemy fighters trying to maneuver onto his tail. Lynch was an experienced pilot, a pre-war veteran who had flown almost daily since Pearl Harbor. He knew the odds he was facing. He also knew that trying to turn with the Zeros would be suicide. His P-38 was faster than the enemy fighters, but they had altitude advantage, and if he tried to simply run away in level flight, they would catch him before he could build up enough speed. He needed to break contact immediately, but every standard escape maneuver he knew required him to turn, which would let the Zeros close the distance even further. In that moment, Lynch made a decision that seemed insane. He rolled his P-38 completely inverted and pushed the stick forward, initiating a vertical dive while upside down. The world inverted around him. The ocean that had been below was now above. The sky that had been above was now below. And the P-38, built like a tank compared to the fragile Zero, plunged toward the ocean at increasing speed, while Lynch's vision turned red from negative G-forces. What happened next stunned Lynch as much as it would later stun the Japanese pilots. The Zeros couldn't follow. When they tried to roll inverted and push into the dive to maintain pursuit, their lightweight airframes began to shudder and warp under the negative G-forces. Worse, their fuel systems, designed for positive G-forces during climbing and turning, couldn't handle the inverted pressure. Fuel stopped flowing to the engines. Carburetors starved. Some of the Zero engines simply quit entirely, leaving their pilots to glide helplessly, while Lynch's P-38 screamed away at ever-increasing speed. Lynch didn't just escape. At 12,000 feet, he rolled right side up, pulled back on the stick, and used his massive speed advantage to zoom back up to altitude. The Zeros, scattered and confused by his impossible maneuver, were now below him and slower. The hunter had become the hunted. Lynch dove on two of them from above, using his superior speed and the element of surprise. His .50 caliber machine guns converged on a Zero that never saw him coming. The Japanese fighter disintegrated under the hail of bullets. When Lynch returned to base and climbed out of his cockpit, his face was covered in small red dots. Burst blood vessels from the negative G-forces had created hundreds of tiny hemorrhages across his skin. His eyes were bloodshot, the whites almost completely red. He had a splitting headache that would last for 3 days, but he was alive, and he had just discovered something that would change everything. Lynch didn't keep his discovery to himself. That evening, over drinks in the pilot's tent, he described exactly what he had done and what had happened. The younger pilots listened with a mixture of disbelief and fascination. Flying inverted was dangerous. Pushing into a dive while inverted was suicidal, or so they had been taught. But Lynch was standing there alive with 2 confirmed kills to show for it. He insisted that the Zeros physically couldn't follow him through the maneuver. The physics of what Lynch had discovered were actually straightforward once you understood them. In normal flight, gravity pulls down on a pilot with 1 g of force. During a normal dive, pulling the stick back to curve downward creates positive G-forces, pressing the pilot down into his seat. Fighter pilots trained constantly to handle high positive Gs, learning to tense their muscles and control their breathing to maintain consciousness under forces that could reach 7 or 8 Gs in violent maneuvers. But an inverted dive created negative G-forces, pushing the pilot up out of his seat and forcing blood into his head instead of his legs. Human beings are poorly adapted to negative Gs. Even 2 or 3 negative Gs can cause unconsciousness in untrained pilots. The blood vessels in the eyes and face burst easily under the reversed pressure. Vision degrades rapidly as blood floods the retinas. It's an unpleasant, painful, disorienting experience. But the critical discovery was that while human pilots could train themselves to tolerate brief periods of negative G-force, aircraft fuel systems couldn't adapt. The Zero's carburetor was designed to work with fuel flowing down from tanks mounted above the engine. When the aircraft went inverted, and then pushed into a dive, gravity suddenly pulled the fuel away from the carburetor intake. The engine would sputter, cough, and often quit entirely. The Zero pilot would find himself flying a glider while his American opponent accelerated away. American aircraft had a crucial technological advantage the Zero lacked. Many U.S. fighters, particularly the P-38 and later models of the P-47 and Corsair, used fuel injection systems rather than carburetors. Fuel injection could maintain consistent fuel delivery regardless of the aircraft's orientation. A P-38 could fly inverted for extended periods without the engines missing a beat. This seemingly minor technical difference suddenly became a life-or-death advantage in combat. The tactics spread through the American fighter squadrons, not through official channels, but through the informal network that fighter pilots have always relied on. When you were about to fly into combat, where the slightest edge might keep you alive, you listened to veterans who had survived. And the veterans were increasingly all telling the same story. If a Zero gets on your tail, don't turn. Roll inverted and dive. The Zero can't follow. Then use your speed to zoom back up and attack from advantage. Pilots started calling it different names. The split S when done from altitude, the inverted escape when used defensively, the negative G dive in formal debriefings. But informally among themselves, pilots called it going upside down on them, and it became the first thing experienced pilots told rookies arriving fresh from stateside training. The official training manual still warned against inverted flight as dangerous and disorienting, but in the Pacific, it was becoming standard procedure. Captain Robert D. DeHaven of the 7th Fighter Squadron scored his first kill using the inverted dive in July 1943. A Zero had gotten behind him during a bomber escort mission near New Georgia. DeHaven rolled inverted, pushed into the dive, and watched in his mirror as the Zero's engine quit trying to follow him. He recovered at 8,000 feet, climbed back up, and caught the Zero still trying to restart its engine. It was the easiest kill of his career, and he would use the same tactic to score 13 more victories before the war ended. The physiological effects of the maneuver were brutal, but survivable. Flight surgeons on Guadalcanal began keeping records of pilots who regularly performed inverted dives, and the data was both fascinating and disturbing. Nearly every pilot who used the tactic reported burst blood vessels in the eyes and face. Headaches lasting hours or even days were universal. Some pilots experienced temporary vision problems. A few lost consciousness briefly during the most violent negative G encounters. But none of that mattered, because the alternative was death. Pilots would joke darkly that they'd rather have a headache and red eyes than a posthumous medal. The flight surgeons documented the effects, but made no attempt to discourage the tactic. They understood what the pilots understood. In air combat against the Zero, you needed every advantage you could find, and a few burst blood vessels were a cheap price to pay for survival. What made the inverted dive particularly devastating was that it completely reversed the tactical situation. Before this discovery, when a Zero got on an American fighter's tail, the American pilot was in serious trouble. His options were limited. His life expectancy measured in seconds. But once pilots mastered the inverted dive, suddenly it was the Zero pilot who was in trouble. The American would roll inverted and dive. The Zero couldn't follow, and within seconds the American was below with massive speed advantage. Then he would pull up in a zoom climb using his momentum to rocket back above the Zero. And now he was in the perfect attack position with the sun behind him. Japanese pilots were completely unprepared for this tactical revolution. Their training emphasized turning combat, exploiting the Zero's magnificent maneuverability to get inside an opponent's circle. They had been taught that American fighters were heavy and clumsy. that they couldn't turn or climb, that they were easy prey if you could just get into a turning fight with them. None of their training addressed what to do when an American fighter suddenly rolled inverted and disappeared in a screaming dive that their Zeros couldn't follow. Japanese pilot Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's highest-scoring aces, wrote about his confusion and frustration when he first encountered American pilots using the inverted dive. He described carefully maneuvering into position behind a P-38, lining up for what should have been an easy kill, only to watch in disbelief as the American rolled completely upside down and dove away. When Sakai tried to follow, his Zero's engine sputtered and quit, forcing him to break off the attack while his opponent escaped. What frustrated Sakai even more was that the Americans would then immediately climb back up and attack from above using their superior speed and the altitude advantage they had gained in the dive. The tactical situation had been completely reversed in just a few seconds. The hunter had become the hunted, and there was nothing Sakai or his fellow Zero pilots could do about it except avoid getting into tail chase situations in the first place. By late 1943, the inverted dive had evolved from a desperate survival tactic to a deliberate combat strategy. American squadron commanders were teaching it openly now, despite the fact that official doctrine still frowned on inverted flight. Colonel Neil Kirby, commanding the 475th Fighter Group, told his pilots bluntly in their mission briefings, "If you try to turn with a Zero, you die. If you try to climb with a Zero, you die. Roll inverted, dive, use your speed, and attack from above. That's how you survive. That's how you win." The P-38 Lightning proved particularly effective at exploiting the inverted dive because of its unique twin-boom design. The aircraft's distinctive shape made it instantly recognizable, and Japanese pilots learned to be wary when they saw the twin-boomed silhouette. P-38 pilots developed a reputation for aggressiveness and unpredictability. They would deliberately bait Zeros into tail chases, then use the inverted dive to escape and reverse the situation. It became a cat-and-mouse game, but now the Americans were increasingly the cats. Captain Thomas McGuire, who would eventually become the second highest-scoring American ace of the war with 38 victories, used the inverted dive to devastating effect over the Philippines in 1944. In one engagement over Leyte Gulf, he deliberately slowed his P-38 to entice a Zero into attacking position. When the Japanese pilot took the bait and closed to firing range, McGuire rolled inverted and dove. The Zero pilot attempted to follow, and his aircraft literally came apart in midair under the negative G stress. The wings folded upward, the lightweight airframe collapsed, and the Zero tumbled into the ocean in pieces. McGuire hadn't even needed to fire his guns. The tactic worked with other American fighters too, though the technique required modifications for different aircraft. The F-4U Corsair, with its massive Pratt and Whitney R-2800 engine, could perform inverted dives that were even more violent than the P-38s. Corsair pilots learned to roll inverted and simply let the aircraft's weight and power carry them down in screaming vertical dives that no Zero could hope to follow. Marine Corps pilots flying Corsairs from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal used the inverted dive to rack up impressive kill ratios against Japanese fighters that had previously seemed unbeatable. The P-47 Thunderbolt, nicknamed the Jug because of its barrel-shaped fuselage, was the heaviest of the American single-engine fighters. That weight was a disadvantage in turning combat, but it became a massive advantage in diving. P-47 pilots could roll inverted and dive so fast that they approached the speed of sound, reaching velocities where the aircraft's controls became sluggish and dangerous. But Japanese fighters couldn't come close to matching these speeds, and P-47 pilots exploited their weight advantage ruthlessly. By late 1944, The story of the inverted dive had spread throughout the Pacific theater like wildfire. Pilots no longer spoke of it as a risky last resort. It had become a standard part of American air combat doctrine. New recruits arriving from the States were drilled relentlessly on the tactic, not as a theoretical exercise, but as a life-or-death necessity. Every squadron briefing, every debriefing after a mission, emphasized one truth. If a zero got on your tail, your first thought wasn't to turn. You rolled inverted, you dived, and you lived to fight another day. Veterans of the tactic became the living legends of the airfields. They were admired and feared not for brute skill alone, but for the ability to manipulate physics against the most fearsome aircraft in the Pacific. Bong, DeHaven, Maguire, and countless others created a new kind of aerial psychology. Japanese pilots, once supremely confident in their unmatched maneuverability, were now cautious, hesitant, and second-guessing their every move. What had been instinctive dominance was now replaced with uncertainty and vulnerability. The inverted dive reshaped not only individual duels, but also entire engagements. Squadron leaders began to orchestrate combat strategies around it. Pairs of Lightnings, Thunderbolts, and Corsairs would bait enemy formations, rolling inverted at the right moment to sow chaos. The dive became both escape and attack, a weapon that no Japanese pilot could predict or counter without taking extraordinary risks. The effect was devastating. Experienced Zero pilots were being shot down at a rate that Japan could not sustain. Even the psychological toll on American pilots, though severe, became a badge of honor. Pilots returned from missions with bloodshot eyes, bruised faces, and headaches from negative Gs, but alive and with kills to their names. Flight surgeons on Guadalcanal adapted to the new reality, documenting injuries but quietly approving the use of the tactic. They understood the calculus. A few burst blood vessels were preferable to becoming a statistic in the ocean below. As the months passed, the cumulative effect of these innovations shifted the balance of the air war. Where American pilots had once flown in constant fear of the Zero's unmatched maneuverability, they now had a tangible edge. Squadrons that mastered the inverted dive and its variations became deadly efficient. Air superiority slowly returned to the Allies, providing crucial support for amphibious assaults and ground campaigns throughout the Solomons, New Guinea, and the Philippines. Meanwhile, Japanese engineers struggled to respond. Designs like the J-2M Raiden and Ki-84 Hayate appeared, promising higher speed and greater durability, but they arrived too late and in insufficient numbers. And even the best Japanese pilots couldn't ignore the underlying physics. The laws of gravity and fuel delivery didn't bend to new blueprints. The inverted dive remained an unstoppable exploit for those who knew it. The very aircraft that had once dominated the skies were now fragile in the face of American ingenuity. By the end of the war, the inverted dive had become legend. It was studied, documented, and eventually formalized as part of aerial combat doctrine. Lessons from the Pacific carried into Korea, Vietnam, and the jet age. Pilots learned that the greatest advantage was not necessarily superior firepower or raw maneuverability. It was understanding your aircraft, understanding your opponent, and using physics itself as a weapon. Richard Bong's legacy, along with the many pilots who survived because of the inverted dive, lived on in classrooms, simulators, and air shows. The twin-boomed P38, now an icon of ingenuity and daring, continues to inspire awe. Visitors to aviation museums can see it suspended above them. Imagine the terror and adrenaline of inverted dives, and grasp the bravery required to do the impossible in a split second. In the end, the story of the inverted dive is more than just a tale of survival. It's a lesson in innovation, courage, and the relentless drive to turn desperation into advantage. One pilot's terror became a tactical revolution. One moment of instinctive defiance against the rules of flight changed the course of a war. And one lesson resonates across generations. Sometimes, to defeat the unbeatable, you have to risk everything and flip the world upside down.
Find stories like this as fascinating as I do, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. Thanks for watching.